If you want to land your dream Scrum Master or Product Owner job, you'll have to ace the interview. I recently got a chance to speak with David West, the CEO of Scrum.org, and I asked him to answer the 10 most commonly asked Scrum Master interview questions. Starting off with, what's the difference between Scrum and Kanban?
They are very complementary, and it's kind of disappointing that people consider them to be, competing approaches or frameworks. Kanban is all about visualizing work, actively managing the items in the workflow, with things like WIP limits, etc., and generally continuously improving that workflow. Scrum is something slightly different. Scrum is about solving complex problems. It's about aligning teams on pursuit of those complex problems through a product goal, a sprint goal, a self-managed team working together to deliver against that, a backlog, etc. So I believe that the two can work in perfect parallel. One, probably the most important thing is to be effective in Scrum, you have to make things transparent. In empiricism, it's the heart of Scrum. Kanban is a great mechanism for making the work transparent, visualizing it through a Kanban board, etc. Obviously, another key element of Scrum is the Daily Scrum. And the Daily Scrum is about, talking about how the work's going, making sure that the team is inspecting and adapting that work. So actively managing the workflow is a fundamental part of that. And then continuous improvement is key to Scrum with the sprint review and the retrospective. The sprint review is about improving with feedback from stakeholders, the product and the outcomes that you're going to do next. And obviously the retrospective is very much focused on improving how you work. So improving the workflow is part of that. So it just seems like the Kanban and Scrum are designed to work together. So I've always been very confused that people would say, they're different and competing approaches.
Okay. Yeah, I see more and more just in different kind of people's approaches and philosophies, a kind of a hybrid of the two, where we've got a Kanban board, but still following the kind of structure of Scrum.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, Darcy. I think that the use of a Kanban board and the difference between a Scrum board and a Kanban board is, semantic to some extent. However, if you're not managing, how long, so you've got aging, then it's probably not going to be a Kanban board. If you've not got WIP limits clearly defined, then it's probably not a Kanban board. And so applying those practices onto your Scrum board to convert it from one to the other, this visual way of work is a really good step, because suddenly you'll realize that you've got this particular, PBI or task on the board, and it's been there for like nine sprints. It keeps going through the sprint cycle, a bit like a sock in your laundry. You got that one sock that keeps going through every time because it gets stuck at the back of your washing machine. So and it's very clear then, because you've got that time sort of measure. Those sort of things are incredibly valuable. So I'm not sure hybrid approach. I think combining these two sets of ideas to what makes sense for you is ideal. Yes.
Now looking at the next question, both Jeff and Ken signed the Agile Manifesto, but the word Agile never appears in the Scrum Guide. So what's the difference between Agile and Scrum?
Well, I think it's, ultimately, I think Scrum is an Agile approach. Agile is that set of ideas that came from obviously the Agile Manifesto in Snowbird, but the word is about being responsive to change, to delivering value to stakeholders rather than following a plan. Those sort of principles. What Scrum does is make that real. It provides a framework which you then have to obviously instantiate. So you've got these ideas that are agile. You then apply the framework. You have to instantiate that into your process. Maybe bring some Kanban in, maybe bring some XP in, and you start working as a team, and then inspecting and adapting based on how that work's going. So you can think of, really, if you're a software person, you can think of you're sort of like, you got the class, the really high level class, then you've got the specialization called Scrum, and then you've got the instance that's in your actual application in the context of your team. So I think that we're all, agile approaches, and Scrum is just a particular one of them.
Yeah, Agile is sort of the umbrella that kind of encompasses all the different frameworks. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think umbrella's kind of nice because that's very symbolic, because obviously you have to bring in also other things that are also under the umbrella, and they fit better together if they're all under that umbrella. Yeah.
All right, now for the next question. Everyone that does Scrum is familiar with the 3 Daily Scrum questions, but they were removed from the latest version of the Scrum Guide. Why were they removed? And do you think the 3 Daily Scrum questions are still valid?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when Ken and Jeff built the guide, because there was a lot of interpretation of Scrum, and so the guide came out to sort of describe, hey, these are the rules of the game. You can do other things, and you probably should be doing other things, but if you want to say it's Scrum, this is the definition of Scrum, which then has led to the work that we do at scrum.org and other organizations. When they created that guide, they were trying to describe enough information in the guide, the minimum they could describe, that allowed people to understand what Scrum was and to actually start using it. So initially, when they talked about Daily Scrum, they described the 3 questions, and that the sort of classic 3 questions: what did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And what's getting in the way? What they found, and because obviously the guide's there, people are using it, seeing people instantiate it, seeing people create their own processes around it, they found, and I think the community found, that that it was becoming a status, or it was being used as a status meeting. Now, a daily Scrum isn't a status meeting. Now, so a Scrum forms in rugby, which is obviously where this is taken from the new product game in the 90s. A Scrum forms in rugby when the ball stops moving, usually because of an infringement, or in the case when I was playing rugby, because I've been beaten up quite horribly and somebody has to carry me off to the medics on the side, because I wasn't very good at rugby. Anyway, so so a Scrum's formed because you're not totally sure. Yes, somebody did have the ball, but you don't want to give them a penalty. You don't want to give them, so you give them and then basically the people that had the ball put the ball in, and the game starts again. So the Daily Scrum, by its very nature, is exactly that. It is a mechanism to get the team going again. The ball is work or outcomes, or hopefully the sprint goal is what you're focused on. And you start working again. The problem is, if it becomes a status meeting, one, everybody prepares for it. Oh my God, we've got to make sure. And it becomes less about getting the game going, and more about, getting kudos, getting, appreciation, showing off, dealing with all those things. And it becomes more about management and the team responding to management, and less about actually the intent, which is to create a psychologically safe environment for the team to get the game going to the best of possible, to form that Scrum and get going. So the 3 questions kind of felt a bit like statusy, and they can still be incredibly valuable, and people should use them if they make sense to them. But just be wary that you're spending all your time focused so much on particularly what you did yesterday and what you're doing today, and not really focusing on how do we get the game going better? How do we focus the next 24 hours better? Who can help me? And being transparent and open in that. So the Scrum Guide changed to sort of like pull back from that, so that it was less about this mechanical execution of those 3 questions, and instead something more about getting the game going again, as it were.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that before. That's a really cool kind of metaphor to help explain exactly what we are looking for in those meetings.
Yes, well, it really helps that I played a bit of rugby, I suppose. That always is a little bit of a help. But I was very bad at it, though, so which probably helps as well. I had a lot of time to observe the game stopping because of me. Yes.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's a really cool way to just kind of think about it, because a lot of times with meetings, you do get kind of stuck in your regular routine. You do what needs to be done to check that off the list. as opposed to, yeah, looking at more kind of in-depth, what can we do to improve?
Yeah, humans have a propensity to be mechanical. When you learn something, to reduce complexity, which Scrum's all about, reducing complexity. Hence the reason why it's so simple, etc. But the problem is sometimes you get into this mechanical routine and you forget about the intent. In the same way as it's a daily Scrum, not a daily stand-up. Yes, people can stand up. Some people obviously physically can't stand up. So that was obviously divisive in that regard. But the other element to that was, let's remind everybody that it's a Scrum. Let's get pushing that forward. Let's get the game going.
This next question actually gets Googled a lot, and it's really critical when it comes to creating a great Scrum team. The question is, who in your organization should be the product owner?
Well, first I would say it probably shouldn't be me. No, having been a product owner a lot. So this is actually a really interesting question, and something that I see a lot in organizations that are adopting Scrum and are new to Scrum. What we see is there's an existing industrial structured organization where you've got specialists who are formed together in teams to deliver. You've got a team leader, a bunch of functional specialists, maybe a functionally specialist team. Work is then managed through a life cycle, going through these specialist teams, and then it's delivered to the end, and magic happens. It's always late, it's always over budget, it's always a bit of a disaster. Now, and Scrum approaches it very differently. You build cross-functional teams that are aligned to the outcomes, the work that's being focused on. And there's three roles. There's people that are actually in the team. They used to be, we used to call them, and we still do call them, I think, developers. It's not a development team anymore, but people that are developing the increment, doing the work. Then you've got two sets of accountabilities addition to that, which are the Scrum Master and the product owner. So when you take an existing organization and you compare it to that, you say, well, all right, we've got business analysts, we've got project managers, we've got maybe a team lead, maybe we've got the manager that runs the group. Who goes where? So they're looking at that thing. I discourage that. I mean, obviously it's important, you need to think about, but let's start instead with, okay, let's look at those accountabilities. So product ownership is all about basically making the decisions about the order of the items and the priority of those items in the backlog to deliver the most value. Ultimately, the accountability of the product owner is to define that product goal, to help the team define that sprint goal, to work with the team to really make sure the most valuable things are being delivered, and to be an active participant throughout the sprint, but also at the sprint review, encouraging the right stakeholders to be involved, to get the feedback, so that you can inspect and adapt it and move and improve and continuously deliver value to your customers. So let's look at who has those traits. Let's look at who cares passionately about the outcomes that are being delivered. Let's look at who has the network of connections for stakeholders. Let's look at who cares deeply about the value that's being delivered and has a connection with the customer and the outcomes in a more clear way. Sometimes that could be a project manager. Sometimes that could be a business analyst. Sometimes that could be a software developer on the team, a tester. Let's look for those people. Now, the trick, though, isn't just who has those passions. It's also who does the management, the organization that team lives in, trust to do it. So then you have to balance that and say, okay, well, they always trust the project manager because the project manager's been there a long time. So it might be the right person. And remember, the project manager can work with the other people in the team that have some of those other traits and make that work. So I try to balance those sort of what characteristics the accountabilities encourage with the trust that the organization needs to place in that person. Because one of the biggest problems, if you've got a product owner that isn't trusted by the management, the organization they're residing in, then they don't get that autonomy, they don't get that freedom to make the right choices. They're always second guessing. And so things like this happen where the team's like, hey, well, so should we do this or this first? And they go, don't know, let me go and talk to some people, I'll get back to you. And that's awful for the team, for the product owner, for everything. The teams slowly will lose trust in the product owner, but also more worryingly, it means they'll maybe sitting around twiddling their fingers while they wait for a response. A great Scrum team has a product owner that makes choices and makes decisions, Now, most organizations don't like that because it also means they're accountable for those decisions. But again, most organizations aren't going to fire you because of that. And the great thing about Scrum is you have these things called sprints. So it's only a small chunk of time. So what is it, a week or 2 weeks that you're wasting? You know, if it is a mistake, instead of the traditional organizations where we spend months trying to make sure that everything's perfect before we move into the next phase. So I think that the right product owner is the one that is both trusted by the organization to be empowered to make those decisions, coupled with the characteristics, the traits that really align to those accountabilities that a product owner has. And if you can get those two things in line, then the people just fall out of the organization because, oh, that person's trusted, they've got many of these traits, but other members of the team's got those traits. Let's pick that person. And sometimes, as I said, it could be a project manager, it could be a business analyst, it could be a tester, it could be somebody that's a software engineer, it could be an SME. It doesn't really matter what their traditional title was, as long as they are both trusted and have some of those traits.
Now here's a quick follow-up. Should the product owner be a dedicated role, or should it be something a product manager or director does alongside their job?
So I believe that product ownership is a full-time responsibility. However, how many teams they support is the question, because it depends on how big the product is, obviously. The reason why I think it's a full-time responsibility, and by the way, none of these things are as black and white as that, but on average, it's a full-time responsibility, is because think about the job that they're doing. They're defining the vision, they're defining the goal, they're looking at the business case, they're managing stakeholders. Managing stakeholders on its own is a full-time job. I mean, it's literally well, it depends on your stakeholders, obviously, but from my experience, can be very painful and ridiculous the amount of time. They're also helping their team make decisions, both at the very strategic level, but also the tactical level. They're trying to understand where the product's going to go in the future. So they're looking at future stuff. They're doing market research. Even if it's a system inside an organization, that market research could be what platform should be working on, you know, in the future. Where's the business going? You know, if it's an internal HR system or a series of components that provide a service to another system. I think my experience is it's very hard, if it is a part-time job, that for them to find the time to effectively do all of those things adequately to keep these very expensive and very capable people that are working in the Scrum team doing the right thing and delivering the most value.
Awesome. Now our next question is a little bit more difficult. How would you deal with a developer that does not want to participate in the daily Scrum, sprint reviews, retrospectives, or planning?
I mean, I'm not sure I'd be a very good Scrum Master, but from what I've observed from Scrum Masters, getting people to participate, whether it be in the daily Scrum or whether it be in the sprint review or be active in sprint planning is always very, very important. Participation ultimately is one of the most important things about knowledge work in this complex world, right? You need everybody to be working together to deliver the value and to solve the problems. It'd be very unlikely that one or two people on a team can solve every problem, and you need everybody involved. However, getting people, particularly on the daily Scrum, because it's 15 minutes, you know, I'm in the middle of it. You always have it at 8 a.m. and I'm busy, I think can be a real challenge. So what I tend to do is, firstly, I try to understand why they don't want to participate. I talk to them about that. Maybe it is because they're dropping their kids off at school at that time. Maybe it's because, you know, they always have their coffee at that time, and it's the only time that the barista that they like is, this is very much a West Coast thing, but a barista that, or New York, barista that they like is available at that time, so they have to go at that time. Maybe there's a very good reason why. The second thing is I then ask them, and hopefully that leads us to, so I ask them then follow-up questions around what they think the daily Scrum's about. And it might be that they highlight it's about status reporting, and they don't need to come because Bob always goes and he knows exactly what I'm doing. And you say, okay, that's really, really interesting. So what about this Bob who always knows what you're doing? Do you think that sometimes he doesn't want to go? Oh no, he loves talking to people. So you start exploring what they think of as a daily scrum in this particular example, or a sprint review, or a retrospective. And hopefully then you can start teasing out some of the misconceptions that are often there. Then if they totally understand it, and if you totally have managed to tease out that, if you've not got logistical issues, then we start really working on the value that they can bring. So you look at, why would it be valuable to other people? I don't want to say you play the guilt card, but you definitely highlight their contribution and why it was so important. The other thing is get them to go, but and when they are going, try to pull them into the event. That if you can do that very nicely, then slowly you can sort of like egg the pudding, as my grandmother would say. You can slowly bring these people in. I think it's very disappointing if they don't want to contribute, but I also think it's very understandable, and usually for good reason. It's very rarely because they just hate everybody and just don't want to work. It's normally because of misconceptions, some timing issues, or a misunderstanding of what it is, or their contribution to it. If you can bring all those things up and look at all those things, then hopefully you've found an opportunity to bring them into the team and to make them be a more active participant in the events that make Scrum kind of work.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great point. All the different things that can come up in people's lives that can cause them to not be able to attend.
And I always assume, Darcy, I don't know if you do, but I assume the best intentions of everybody. I mean, I'm often very disappointed driving in Boston because Boston drivers obviously don't necessarily conform to this pattern. But in general, I always assume that people's best, and the reasons why, they're not trying to be nasty. They're not trying to be in a pain. What they're being is true to themselves. And maybe it's important for me to understand why that they've got these challenges. So we at scrum.org, we run something called the Platinum Rule. It's similar to the Golden Rule, but a little bit better. The Golden Rule says you do unto others as as you would do unto yourself. The Platinum Rule is you do unto others as they need to be done on, as it were. So you consider their needs, and that applies to everything. If you can apply that in the context of this, you start from a position of wanting to learn why they don't. You don't order them, you don't shout at them, you don't berate them, you don't do any of those things. There's just no need, and there's no value to that. Instead, you try to understand where they're coming from, and then hopefully you can learn something, and it might actually improve those events, because maybe those events aren't as effective as they could be. Maybe we could make some changes to them. Always come in that scientist, curious mode, and then I think you can be in a very good position.
Here's the next question. What's the difference between a servant leader and a leader who serves?
It's interesting because servant leader actually was removed from the Scrum Guide in the last release, not because Scrum Masters aren't servant leaders, but the reason why is because they're leaders first that serve. It's always very easy to, when you've got the servant word first, it implies that you go and get the coffees, the person does all the facilitation, you run the Zoom, you press the record on the Zoom, you manage all of that sort of stuff, because it's serving, right? But ultimately, you lead first. That means you create the invitation, for instance, not the physical invitation in Outlook or on Google, but the invitation of why people are here and the opportunity to participate. So you lead with the invitation. You ensure that everybody's got the right things, knowledge, experience, appreciation of why you're there, etc. beforehand. You lead by demonstrating psychological safety and vulnerability and all those things. And by leading in that way, you ultimately serve the people. The bottom line, I think, about Scrum, and this isn't just true of Scrum, this is true of all knowledge work in my experience, Darcy, that you need to have a psychologically safe environment to be successful. And that means that the best way of doing that is not to create confrontational type leadership, not to lead by authoritarianism or Machiavellianism, but it's to lead by service. You know, my gran, I mention her again because she was pretty awesome, and she used to say to me when I came home from school, not what have you done today? She'd say, who have you helped today? Who have you helped? And I think that service mantra, and by the way, I often said nobody usually, and that was always a bit of a crisis, and then it all went horribly wrong. But that service mantra, I think, is both enriching for you as a human being, but also enriching in terms of the environment it creates for the team to be successful. We need psychological safety to create an environment where transparency is easy, because we're solving complex problems. By not, you know, to sort of quote the space shuttle, you know, Challenger disaster, by not having a psychologically safe environment that we can say, hey, those O-rings aren't working. We're not going to solve those problems. Now, psychological safety means something different to every organization, every context. But I think what all of them have in common is the need for a Scrum Master to come in ultimately in a service position, but still lead. So not serve first, lead first in that service mindset. So when I talk about servant leadership, I'm very much talking about providing a service to the team through leading by example, providing clarity, by ensuring that everybody has a good invitation as to why they're there, what they're working on, and I help everybody in the team to do that.
Awesome, yeah. All those kind of things just help build that positive atmosphere too, which just increases productivity even further.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Motivated people do deliver a lot more if you're not scared. So the word safety is important. Being scared, ultimately, people think that being scared, you know, when you see all these sports films and you're like got these coaches that berate their people and shout. I think Ted Lasso is a great movement in the right direction around that. I don't know if you've seen the TV show, but for the first time we realized that actually the most successful coaches are not people that scare, that they're people that create an environment of positivity, as you describe, happiness, motivation, and they do it through that positive outlook. And I think it's, you know, I just wonder how good some of those sports teams back in the 60s and 70s would have been if their coaches had been more empathic to the needs of their players. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just a hippie. I don't know.
I guess we'll never know. My next question then would be, what type of metrics can a Scrum team use to gauge their progress?
Well, I think the most interesting metric is about the outcomes that the team's delivering against. So the last release of the Scrum Guide added something called a product goal. A product goal, the word goal is really important, has a line in it. So you can measure when the ball crosses it or when you score. So a bit like OKRs, you need to have a definition of why the team is there and a mechanism to measure success against the reason why they're there. So the goal and the metrics around this, or the objective and the key results, as you're using OKRs. Now, the idea of having that goal is then incrementally, one sprint at a time, you make progress against that goal. So the most important metrics that you should be measuring are progress against that goal. Hopefully your sprint goals allow you to measure that. I'm not a big fan of things like velocity and story points and all of these things. They can be interesting tools to use for the team themselves to judge their challenges and their problems, in the same as if you use Kanban, you'll be using aging or WIP limits or other things around that, maybe cumulative flow, maybe right sizing. All of these things are really good techniques to help the team, but they're not techniques that should be used to, you know, gauge the team by externals. The most important measure the team has is the success that they're delivering. And that's measured against the product goal. Now, that puts the burden not just on the team, it also puts the burden on the product owner and the stakeholders that product owner works with to clearly articulate the product goal and the sprint goals, and to help the team articulate the sprint goals, to actually have some demonstrable process, to build that almost a contract around what it means to be successful, what it means to deliver value. That's why I think, you know, the work of John Doerr and others on OKRs has really helped us to execute Scrum more effectively, because they, by their very nature, encourage organizations and leaders to think about objectives, to describe objectives. Now, the bad thing about OKRs is it's very easy to interpret objectives as do the work, and the work is done when, which is completely wrong. The objective needs to be something more in line with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, hopefully for your customer, maybe for your organization. I think that's the key thing. The outcomes the team delivers against that product goal are the things that I would always use to gauge progress. And things like story points, velocity, even to some extent quality, are metrics that we use internally to help us improve to deliver against that value metric. That is the thing that that gauges our success.
Okay, and then how would you scale beyond a single Scrum team?
Well, that's obviously a very loaded question. So it depends, obviously, is the answer that I would use. So ultimately, the best Scrum teams that I've ever seen are teams that have a clear line of sight to customer, have an environment that creates psychological safety and trust and allows them to do the things that they need to do, is supported technically so they're basically getting better, mastering their craft, as it were, whether it be a community of practice or in the Spotify, sort of guild chapter kind of thing. They're the most successful teams. When you add multiple teams, the biggest challenge, things start getting difficult. The biggest challenge is around dependencies. When the teams are heavily dependent on each other, it increases that amount of complexity. So that's the reason why we developed something called the Nexus, which, yes, I was part of writing a book on, but I won't bore you with that. My mum is very proud. The Nexus creates basically transparency across teams. So you're working together on a pursuit, a product. You've got a clear product goal. Each team is working one element in a sprint against that product goal. They have sprint goals. Then you have something called the Nexus integration team, which brings that all together to ensure you get that daily sort of cycle of visibility against that, to ensure impediments and dependencies are being managed in the most effective way. When you scale across multiple products, then it starts getting really complicated and it starts becoming incredibly difficult. So personally, and I have to say, people balance this sort of traditional organizational construct with a more or less traditional Scrum model. The most successful organizations that have scaled beyond a single product using the same approach tend to organize around objectives, goals, customers, or value streams. So they align multiple Scrum teams in pursuit of a value stream. So you can think of the Spotify model, the tribe. They then they sort of like keep these separate, very separate, no minimum dependencies between them. And then they create a layer of intellectual sort of connection via the communities of practice or the chapters or the guilds. So you've got that sort of like people sharing best practices, people circulating through these different tribes or these different teams focused on bits of the value stream. I think organizations, and then you slowly, equip the organization to create the environment that's necessary to build those Scrum teams. At the end of the day, it's all about helping these teams function in the most effective way and building that environment. It isn't the opposite way of thinking about it, where you have this big organization and these are only little cogs. It's the opposite. We're flipping the organization. And that's really hard. It really changes the way you think about planning and investments. It changes how you think about governance. It changes how you think about promotion and incentives and bonuses. It changes how you think about support models, career paths. It changes. There's so many things that it changes. And I have to say, Darcy, I've not seen that many organizations, really big organizations, traditional organizations that are very successful in the domain that they're in, do it that effectively. You get pockets of teams and teams of teams working really well, but then as it grows out, the dysfunctions of a large industrial sort of complex get in the way. So I guess my words of wisdom were, if you have to scale, be very careful, do it one team at a time, and continue to protect those teams as you grow.
For sure. I imagine it can be hard to lose focus, or I mean, it's easy to lose focus as you get more and more things to kind of be on top of.
It's dependencies, oversight, the fact that if you've got 100 teams, a sprint actually costs a lot of money. So suddenly you're like, oh shit, should I spend a little bit of time up front making sure that I'm spending the right money? So so we do analysis sprints then. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. We just spent the same amount of money we were going to spend that when we're actually doing it to decide where we're going to do it. It's like those meetings that you have, you got $1,000, you're going to, somebody wants to go to a class or to a conference. And so you have a meeting with 10 people to talk about whether Bob should go to this conference to spend this $1,000. And you look around the room and the loaded cost is, over $100 each. And there's 10 of you in the room. So you've already spent more than sending Bob to that conference without even thinking about it, And I know you could argue Bob's time at the conference, that adds an amount. So that's probably 2,000, not 1,000. But my point is that we seem to be, as soon as things get big, we get scared, we get nervous, impacts get much larger, and it slows everything down. It's funny, I was talking to this was years ago, the guys at SpaceX, and one of their guys was presenting, and I happened to be at a conference with him, and we were talking, and I was presenting, he was presenting, so we just had this little chat. And I said, how many people have you got working in this part of SpaceX? They did all the telemetry that put the spaceship up, did the stuff and landed it. It was 34. I said, God, that doesn't sound very many. How many people did NASA have? He goes, about 5,000. I was like, oh my God. I said, are you got enough people? Are you going to be growing? And he goes, yeah, we probably need 3 or 4 more people. I'm like, hang on, it's order of magnitude different, right? But you can't argue with their progress. They're good.
Yeah. That's funny. Okay. And then the Scrum Guide does not require the Scrum Master to be a part of the Daily Scrum. Do you agree with this? And why would you say that is?
So the point of the Daily Scrum is it's an opportunity for the people on the field that are working together to actually deliver in the increment to get together to move the ball forward again. If the Scrum Master isn't adding value to that, then they shouldn't be there. Scrum Masters aren't crutches. They're not, it's not a project manager that everybody's reporting to every day to make sure we're making progress. A Scrum Master is, as we talked about earlier, a servant leader, somebody that's enabling the team to be successful. Their accountabilities are focused on Scrum, on ensuring that that things are transparent, that the work is, that the team knows what they're doing, how they're approaching it, make sure that that problems escalate, etc. Now, if that's not necessary to be from the Daily Scrum, then they don't have to be at the Daily Scrum. They don't have to facilitate every event. They don't have to, be part of everything. Their job is to ensure that everything happens, in inverted commas. You know what I mean? To ensure that Scrum is actually working to deliver the value that it promises. And I think it's important sometimes that a Scrum Master empowers other people and ensures that they can take ownership of things. I think that's ultimately the idea of agility, right? It's about being agile and not being dependent on any one person or one team or one thing. So you can inspect and adapt and change as necessary. I think ultimately most daily scrums, the Scrum Master is there because they have a key value in terms of helping the team make things transparent, providing that external perspective on the work. However, they aren't necessary some days. And it's important that any good Scrum Master realizes that and doesn't fall into the mistake, the habit of trying to become a crutch for the team so that their career progresses, they get the promotions. It's a bit like parenting. The most important job of a parent is to help your children survive in the world without you, right? Even though many days you really don't want that ever to happen because you really love your kids and you want them to want you all the time. And being a parent of a 9-year-old at the moment and seeing that sort of like tension, I think is very illustrative of how sometimes a Scrum Master becomes super dependent. Luckily, I've become dependent. My son is dependent on me because he can't load new apps on his iPad without my password. So, got a win there. So he'll need me, and I'm never giving that up, even when he goes to college, even when he's an adult.
Awesome. Perfect. And then I think my last question here is going to be, what is the definition of done, and why is it so important to define on your team?
Definition of done. The definition of done is an interesting, we call it a commitment. It's a commitment to the increment. The idea is that so the increment in Scrum is the increment. So you've got the product goal, and you're making incremental progress towards that product goal, and the increment manifests itself as that, right? So the definition of done says, what does it mean to be done for this increment, so that you can review it effectively. The reason why we have commitments like the definition of done, like the product goal, like the sprint goal, is because it provides a level of transparency for the team. So instead of having this sort of like, is this done? Is this not done? Question, it's done because we've hit the end of the sprint. Yeah, hey, really? Is it? It's good to have that definition, because it creates two things. Not only does it ensure a level of quality often on your increment, but it also ensures you're having those conversations. You're having those conversations what it means to be done. You're having those conversations about what does quality mean. Actually, we recently had at Scrum.org had a really interesting conversation about what does it mean to release a new module for one of our classes, professional Scrum Master class. And we have a definition of done, but nobody had looked at, actually, which was interesting, considering we're all very Scrum, we're all experts at Scrum, right? But cobbler's children and all that sometimes. So we dusted off the definition of done and said, oh my God. And then we argued about it for a bit and disagreed with it and changed some stuff, because a lot of our classes now are in Mural and are online and stuff. The definition done wasn't particularly up to date. So it gave us a great opportunity to refresh our sort of joint, the team, and actually stakeholders' opinion of what definition of done ever. We even involved marketing, which is always a disaster, because they're like, well, you have to update the data sheet. Oh gosh, really? Do we? When we make a change. I mean, so we're never involving them again, because it means more work, which is obviously a disaster. So definition of done provides that transparency, as the other commitments do. The product goal, which is a commitment to the product backlog, the sprint goal, which is the commitment to the sprint backlog, and the definition to done, which is the commitment to the increment.
It's an interesting, I would never think about the fact that it does change over time, and as the business evolves and as the way that we do things change, that so do our definitions.
Oh, totally changes over time. And in fact, if it isn't changing, it probably means you're not looking at it. Not saying we weren't, but yeah, it needs to change, and it's a key artifact for that. That's what and it's there to provide transparency. Remember, Scrum is all about an empirical process, which encourages transparency. The three pillars, inspection, adaptation, through transparency, right, are crucial. And things like this, definition done, is one of the minimal elements that we think is necessary to provide that transparency about the increment.
And that's how you ace a Scrum Master interview.